was waiting is making their way in, so I think thanks Joe for policing the sign-in sheet here for us today. I will call the Planning Commission meeting to order here in the City Council chambers now on March 4th, 2019. Chairperson Mayor Zach Verwink, and we'll go around just for the benefit of the viewing audience here or on the recording. Adam, introduce yours for introductions.
Adam Tagan, Community Development Director.
Thad Kubiszak, Commissioner, City Council Representative.
Shane Burkhart, Commission Member.
Tom Bry, Commission Member.
Sue Wesley, Commission Member.
Joe Terry, Secretary.
Thank you. And we'll move on to item number 1 on our agendas, the approval of the report from the February 11th, 2019 Planning Commission meeting. Commissioners, what are your wishes regarding that item?
Move is approved.
We have a motion to approve by Bry. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Wesley. Any discussion on the report? Seeing no requests to speak, we'll move into a vote. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? The ayes have it. Item 2, maps and plats received. There were no maps or plats received at this meeting. So we'll move on to item number 3, 2019 and February 25th, 2019. So with that, I will open the public hearing. And since we have 2 public hearings this evening, I will repeat myself for folks that don't maybe get it the first time. So I will call the folks wishing to address the body or the Planning Commission here, those for or against the project, and to the podium, and make sure that the microphone is on. It'll have a green light on the bottom of it, so that way we can pick you up on the recording, and certainly so we can hear you up here. So with that said, Phil, do you want to come to the podium to talk about the public hearing on the TIF, the TID number 8?
Thank you, Mayor. Good evening. Phil Costin with Ellers and Associates. So before I get too far into the project plan, I want to make sure everybody has a copy in your packet of the TID number 8 project plan. If you don't, let me know, and I'm more than happy to bring a copy of a few extras along. Well, we've been working closely with city staff to put together a new tax increment district. This would be number 8. And I'm going to spend a few minutes talking first a little bit about process, and then I'll talk a little bit about the project plan itself, and kind of give you direction as to where we're going with this as far as timeline. So when we create a tax increment district, there's a couple of steps involved, and the first is that we need to work on putting together what's called a project plan, and that's what's in your packet. Once that project plan is put together, we send out notices for the public hearing, which is tonight, and we also send out notices to the other taxing bodies, which is the school, county, technical college, and invite them to what's called a joint review board meeting. And the joint review board meeting met today at 3:30 and organized, meaning they selected a citizen member and a chairperson, and then we went through the project plan with them. And then they establish a final joint review board meeting, which will occur, in this case, scheduled for April 1st. Now that that's completed, then we come to the public hearing, which is tonight on TID number 8. If you are comfortable with the project plan as laid out, there is a resolution in your packet that you would approve tonight. And if you approve it, it'll be forwarded on to the City Council. And City Council action is scheduled for March 19th. If it's approved at March 19th, then it'll go back to that joint review board I talked about earlier that met today, and they will meet for final approval. So you're really holding the public hearing, and you're the first of the 3 approvals needed to create a new district. So Plan Commission, Council, and then Joint Review Board all have to approve it before it's in place. So we put together the project plan, working again closely with city staff. I don't know everybody's understanding of TIF here. I'm not going to get into a lot of the nuts and bolts of tax increment law in Wisconsin, but I'm going to take you through the project plan relatively quickly. I see we have a room full of people behind me. They're going to get an education on TIF as well. So this is in relation to the development proposal coming forward from Matelco, and they are I think there's been enough press probably, and people understand that that project is moving forward. While this is happening, just so you know, there's also a development agreement that is being worked on right now between the company and the city. That is pretty far along now, and I think there's going to be a separate meeting in regards to the development agreement as well. So that's a companion piece with the creation of the tax increment district. So in the project plan, if you go to page 4, if you have that in front of you, I'll just give you a little bit on the executive summary and talk about location, et cetera. So the executive summary gives you some high-level detail of the actual tax increment district. And what we're approving tonight is the tax increment district. We're not approving the project, the Metelco project, but they're actually putting in place the tax increment district as a financing vehicle for the city. So this would be TID number 8. The district is 73.85 acres of land currently owned by the city of Wisconsin Rapids. This will overlay, this new District 8 will overlay a portion of tax increment district number 6 that's already in place. So this will overlay a portion of that. This will be what's called an industrial district, meaning it has to have at least 50% of the area or more by acreage suitable for industrial purposes. And that certainly is the case here. And we have estimated project costs over time of $2.85 million that include really 3 different items. A rail spur, which is a significant reason that they did choose Wisconsin Rapids is access to rail. That dollar amount is $600,000 for the rail spur, of which the city is applying for a T grant, which is Transportation Economic Assistance Grant, through the Wisconsin DOT, and that the anticipation is that the city will receive a $300,000 grant through the T grant program. So the TIF portion would be the differential of $300,000. In addition to that, there are development incentives that are broken up in 2 different methods of $1 million, and then also there is some road project work that's in the future that's being talked about as well. In return, what the city is being guaranteed is an $8 million minimum value guarantee from the company. They're going to spend a lot more than that to construct this facility and for the equipment. It'll be a much greater number than that. But from a taxable basis, what's being talked about is $8 million minimum value guarantee that will be spelled out in the development agreement. That's what we use to base our cash flow on then, is that minimum value guarantee. In addition to that, they're talking about somewhere between 80 and 100 jobs over a period of time. And there is some statistics that were cited earlier for the Joint Review Board as to the level of pay at those jobs that I'm sure can be answered by staff if you would like that information. But they're promising 80 to 100 jobs in addition to the $8 million development. An industrial tax increment district can stay open for no longer than 20 years. Our initial cash flows, which takes into account all the project costs identified, takes into account just the $8 million of development, allows for an early closure for this tax increment district, meaning it doesn't take the full 20 years for that district to pay back. It pays off 4 years earlier than that. So there's a 16-year payback on this district. If you go into the project plan a little further on pages 8 and 9, this is the location. You can see that the parcels, there are 4 parcels that are being brought into this new tax increment district 8. They were all originally, again, part of tax increment district number 6, and that's reflected on the map shown on page number 9. So again, we're overlaying a piece of TID 6 to be able to, and why would we do that, I guess, if you're asking yourself? We do that to reset the clock, I'll call it. So we're starting a new TIF on top of that older district, allowing a maximum of 20 years on this new site, this new TID 8 site. It enables you to capture revenue for a longer time period and repay the costs that have been identified within the project plan and ultimately the development agreement. So that's the location. There's a listing of the parcels on page 11. Again, they're all city-owned parcels. There was comment earlier about East Commerce Drive. That will be vacated. That's part of the development agreement. My understanding, it's not really a road. It's a platted road, and that's about it at this point. But that'll be vacated and to make room for this development as well. Within the project plan then also, and I've talked about this a little bit, if you go to page 20, we have identified the project costs that that will be spelled out in the development agreement. And what the city is committed to for this project is the rail spur of $600,000. Again, anticipation of a $300,000 T grant to pay for half of that. $1 million development incentive, how that's broken up is $400,000 up front to the company, based on certain parameters being met. It's not just going to them day one. It'll be distributed to them once they hit certain targets, and then $600,000 of the $1 million will come back to them out of their own increment, which is taxes that they are generating. They're getting a piece of that back over a time period up to $600,000. That's all factored into the cash flow that we have built. So a portion up front and a portion over time to help minimize the risk to the city. And then we've again identified a road project not in the boundaries of the district, which is the 48th Street North project that if there is sufficient cash flow in the district, will be paid for out of the tax increment revenue as well at a later date once it's identified as being needed. Finally, we do have in here a series of cash analysis that lead to the cash flow, pages 24 and 25. Again, 24 shows the $8 million coming online. 25 shows the actual, what are called increment. Increment, again, is taxes that are being paid by just that company. You can see that at $8 million, that would be $226,000 a year of increment taxes that they'll be paying in the city. Right now, that value is zero. It's city-owned property with no revenue coming in on those parcels. So it's substantial investment by the company. And then finally, the last document to really share with you is 26. That's the cash flow. There's a lot of numbers on there. I know not everybody's a numbers person or numbers geek like me, but you can see on here that what we've identified is the revenues, and then in the first part of the page, in the middle of the page are the expenditures that I just talked about earlier, and then cash flows on the far right, and the closure being 4 years earlier than the allowed life. There's a number of other items in the project plan that are statutory, required to be included by tax increment law that we have to have in the project plan. Annex property, how much is going to be devoted to retail business of the land, zero. Proposed zoning ordinance changes, master plan work, if any property is being anybody being relocated on the site. Those type of things all have been identified as required in the project plan by the state. So that's a quick summary of the project that's being in the project plan and the project being brought forward. I know it's very exciting for the city. They've been working on this for a long time to get it to this point. There is, as I said, a companion piece to this, which is the development agreement. Now, this is the financing tool. This is how we, come up with the dollars to work on this project. That's the TID. The development agreement is the we're going to do X, you do Y, and we're all on the hook for this. That's going to be brought forward to a special finance committee meeting. Is it in 2 weeks?
The 14th, next
14th.
Thursday.
So that'll be brought forward. The city's working with outside counsel and also the city attorney to put together that agreement as well. So with that, I'll be happy to answer questions relative to the project plan, and I'm sure both the mayor and Adam Teagan would be more than happy to answer questions as it pertains to the project itself.
Thanks, Phil. Commissioners, any questions on what's been presented? We've got the public hearing open, and I would move into that phase of input if there isn't any from the commission. Okay, thanks, Phil.
Thank you.
Are there any members of the public that wish to speak on this particular item to the commission related to the establishment of a tax increment district? Either for or against? Bill? You come on up. If you could state your name and your address for the record, please.
Thank you. Well, my name is Bill Clendenny, and I represent the town of Grand Rapids, and I also represent people in the area on the county board in District 15. I just have a few questions on it. I'm not speaking for or against the project. I would like to know what portion of 48th Street does the city of Wisconsin Rapids have control over? Is there control between 54 and the railroad tracks?
There's not. No,
There's not.
n-
And after the, and then we go up on 48th Street again, and then you do have no control after the property.
Right.
So I would like to know, but what about increase in truck route, increase in traffic and stuff like that? I don't understand why you don't own a portion of that road going into your district there. And it's a concern of me because of Mariani also having an increase in truck traffic of over 100 trucks a day now. So I would certainly like to be able to tell my constituency exactly what's going on and what's going to be done and what is all this truck traffic going to do to the roads that we own. So, thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else wishing to address the body on this particular item? For or against, or further question for us to address after the public hearing? For the third and final time, anyone wishing to address the body on this particular item? Seeing none, we'll go ahead and close the public hearing at 4:22 p.m. And we'll move on to item number 4, which is consideration of a resolution designating proposed boundaries and approving a project plan for the tax increment district number 8, City of Wisconsin Rapids. So Commissioners Phil's gone through that. For those that were at the Joint Review Board, that was your second iteration of that presentation. Are there any items for discussion or clarification? To address some of the traffic concern or question, obviously, if the property surrounding a road is not in the city's corporate limits, there is no responsibility of the municipality on that particular road. So the question that was raised, and until the property on one side of the street is in the corporate limits, there won't be any obligation to the municipality. It's obviously in the municipality's, the current municipality's obligation, which I believe Bill's comment was pertaining to the town of Grand Rapids and the constituency around there. It is a desire, I think, by the proposed user, Metalco, as well as other users, to have some additional accommodations or consideration given to 48th Street in the future, given the amount of truck traffic and the volume that it's currently experiencing with Mariani's most recent expansions, or even this new project. So that's why in the project plan, we've identified that as a potential funding source, or the TIF as a funding source potentially for improvements to 48th Street. Some historical perspective, I think it was maybe 10 years ago, the city put that particular project in the state's consideration for their STP urban program, given that the project didn't score high enough, I believe, and that's why East Grand now this year was replaced with that project. So we'll continue to look at other funding sources at the state level. And then I believe this week there's actually going to be a conversation had between some of the businesses in that area, as well as the neighboring municipality, the town, and some representation from the city to talk about 48th Street and Washington Street, both of which are constructed to a standard not necessarily to handle industrial or commercial truck traffic, but will have to be addressed in the future. So that would be the answers that I would have. I don't know if Joe or Adam, if you've got anything further to add related to that on that item. Okay, commissioners, any other items for consideration? Otherwise, the resolution is attached. Doesn't have a number, obviously, on it because we haven't passed it, but number 1 probably. Yeah, right, for 2019. We did have some discussion at the Joint Review Board as well pertaining to boundaries and the ability to amend the district 4 times over the course of the life, should we decide to bring in additional property or cite additional projects that could potentially be funded by the TIF. So I would just make that clarification. So the ability to amend that or flexibility. Commissioners, what are your wishes on that resolution?
I motion to approve as presented.
We've got a motion by Burkhart to approve. Is there a second? Second by Wesley. Any further discussion? Seeing none, we'll move into a vote. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The ayes have it. Thank you for engaging on that important topic. Exciting project, as Phil said, and we'll restate or reiterate if folks want to know more about the project specifics to attend the presentation scheduled for 5 p.m. The 14th, so a week and a half from now, likely to be in this room because of the nature of the discussion. So thanks again. Move on to our second public hearing tonight, and that is item 5 is a public hearing on Plan 190057, Premier WI Rapids LLC. The applicant is requesting a rezoning from the R3 multifamily medium-density residential district to R4 multifamily high-density residential district. The subject property is located adjacent to 3411 Washington Street. With that, I'll open the public hearing here at 4:26 p.m. I'll invite the folks from Premier forward if they'd like to take the opportunity to speak to the commission and to the public here. Nice to see you guys again.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it, Mayor. My engineer, John Dable, is sitting next to me, but he's having a little voice problem or recovering
Or
from some
claiming.
voice. So I get to be the engineer and the representative today. So my name is Chris Slater. I'm the president of development for Premier Pre3, and we own the piece of property that we're looking to develop and change the zoning on. We're looking to build 48 apartments on that site, 4 12-family apartments. My friend John does have a rendering of what those buildings will look like at the end of the day. A little bit of background on Premier. We're a 40-year-old company that's privately held based out of Brookfield. We operate apartments throughout the Midwest and have a couple communities here in town as well, including the adjacent site to the parcel that we're trying to develop. So we operate the 24 units River's Edge right now in town. We're looking to make some continued investments in Wisconsin Rapids. We've had good success operating those communities, and want to again to keep investing here in Wisconsin Rapids. So the 12-family itself, all 2-bedroom apartments. Each unit will have has an attached garage and a private entrance. They're around 1,100 square feet. The apartments will have washer, dryer, refrigerator, stove, range. They're nicely, have some nice amenities. We've had great success building this building throughout the state of Wisconsin. So we've built roughly about 4,000 apartments throughout the state. We've gone as far north as Wausau, Rhinelander, and we've gone all the way down to Beloit. We've been to New Holstein. We're actually tonight, one of my counterparts is in Plover, looking at another community. So had a lot of really good success with this building, and know we can be successful here in Wisconsin Rapids based both off of the building plan and then also the operations that we have here, knowing the market and being so familiar with it. The investment itself, again, we're going to be about 1,000 or 1,100 square feet. Apartments will range rent-wise around $1,000 is what we're hoping to lease those out at, plus or minus based off of how we come in with our final cost. To protect that investment, we do have a management company. We operate around 15,000 apartments throughout the Midwest. We've got 550 employees that help us make sure that our investments are sound, that the day-to-day operations of those buildings is well taken care of. On a site like this, we actually have a small office with a place for a resident manager to take care of the site, to do the leasing. We'll have a maintenance tech on site to answer and take care of those residents' concerns when it comes to clogged garbage disposals or toilets or whatever the case may be. we take a lot of pride in that management with those residents as being such a big customer of ours. This development would generate probably around $100,000 a year or annually of tax revenue. So that's what we're estimating based off of a finalized value. I think that would be a sizable amount, but we're making a good investment here for the apartments. Mentioned the management company. We're definitely excited about this. We've tried to come up here to Wisconsin Rapids and develop another site. I know I've been in front of you guys on another parcel, and we're going to keep trying. So I'm hoping that we can connect on this one. I know we need a little minor zoning change, but I think we own the development next door, and I think this is a really suitable parcel. We tried to have and make a conscientious site plan that didn't go through our neighboring property of River's Edge. We actually have an easement to drive right through that, but we took the drives and tried to get them around so that there wasn't concern of resident traffic at this site going through and interfering or creating problems for those residents next door. So we tried to go down this little truncated attachment to the street, as you can see in the site plan. So we're trying to be thoughtful in the process of both our existing site and then this future one. But again, I think in the end, we're really excited about this and hope it to be a good development. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions or go through anything in more detail if I didn't touch on it already.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah.
Okay, we will now move into similar process to the last public hearing. Those wishing to address the commission at this stage for the proposed rezoning may come to the podium at this time. We ask you to state your name and your address for the record, or to propose additional questions if there are questions, if you're not necessarily in one camp or the other, for or against.
My name is Mary Ann Mishaw. I live at 3411 Washington Street, River Grove, apartment 306. We are objecting to the changing of the zoning for family units, mainly because of loss of our safety. Many of our residents walk along the property between our units for exercise. They use walkers, they use canes. Some of us, myself included, aren't the best stable. And we know that there will be more traffic, and we fear for our safety. We also fear the loss of wildlife and of our peace and quiet. And we are all objecting it. We sent a petition in, and I'm hoping some of my other cool hearts will speak. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mike Hittner, 980 First Avenue South. This is a great civic lesson here, ladies and gentlemen. This is senior citizens coming out to protect what they consider an affront to their interests, and I think it's a great lesson for all of us to learn. I would just ask, Mr. Chairman, that I agree, of course, with these folks here, but I would ask that you have a roll call vote on the vote from the commissioner.
Thank you. Other requests to speak, or individuals not requesting but wishing to speak, sorry.
My name is Karen Steiner, and I live at 3411 Washington Street, apartment 102. We have been very concerned about this since we just found out about it here a couple of weeks ago. I would like to know about that pond. What are you going to do about protecting the area? I understand that this pond is not going to have a fence around it. And we're also concerned about the bugs and the mosquitoes that are going to be there. And if there's going to be children around at these multifamily apartments, I'd like to know how safe that's going to be for the children that are going to be living there. And who is going to be liable for that? Also, we're going to lose the serenity of the area and the quietness, and that's the reason why we moved in there. There must be another location because we feel that this is really an invasion on our homes as we live there. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Janie Romatowski. I live on 3731 Washington Street. I live in a private home there. I'm not in the senior units. I own the property that would be bordering this. We've had a company farther down move in earlier, a couple years ago, and we've had people on our property on a regular basis. It's private property, and I'm concerned about somebody getting hurt on my property. I'm concerned about the quietness. The senior center next to me has been great. I've never had any problem. And this is a really good problem for me right now is I've just lost my husband. So I'm by myself there, and I can't have people on the property. I can't watch it all. Thank you.
Thank you. Joe, do you need to, ma'am, can you state your name again just one more time for Joe, for the record? Jane. Okay, thank you. Other individuals wishing to speak in the public hearing here. I'll call for the second time. Is there anyone else wishing to speak? Scott?
I'm Scott Kellogg. I live at 511 Elm Street, and I'm speaking on behalf of the project. When you look at the medium income in Wisconsin Rapids, it's $38,322, and compared to Wood County overall, it's $51,603. And we need affordable housing for the community of Wisconsin Rapids. And any project you come up with, you're going to find people showing up and sharing their concern. And they have legitimate concerns. But any project can be made conditional. And listening to the concerns they have, conditional initiatives can be made with the developer, hopefully to remedy any concerns that they have. The Wisconsin Rapids Housing Study in 2016, 32% of the residents stated they know someone who is struggling with housing costs and may be in danger of becoming homeless. Yeah, the Encourage Community Study in 2017, 49% of the residents said because of access to quality, affordable housing is a very important priority in the future of the community. An additional 38% of the residents said it was somewhat important. Encourage Community Study, also in 2017, 45% of the residents said increased access to affordable housing is very important priority for the future of the community. An additional 42% of the residents said it was somewhat important. You can't attract businesses if you don't have locations and affordable housing for their employees. And you found that out with the presentation that was earlier. You're not going to have businesses come to Wisconsin Rapids if there's not affordable housing. Wisconsin Rapids Study need for more quality and affordable housing options for both owners and renters. And the research with regard to health, I was working with the health department and a group from the health department. Affordable quality housing, as a result of that, the individuals have more resources for needs such as healthcare, health food, and transportation, and also increased financial security and safety and decrease of stress. and it's important for a healthy community. Most appropriate, this is, I think, a most appropriate location when you look at the housing in that area. There's a number of multi-family housing, and it's as neighbors right in that area, so it's not plopped in to one just residential area. It promotes economical development, and employees will work in Wisconsin Rapids and spend money in Wisconsin Rapids. I know many individuals work in Wisconsin Rapids, live in Plover, and spend their money in Plover. If this development is not approved, then what development would be approved and where? And if this development is not approved now, then when will you approve a development? Any questions?
Thank you. Anyone else wishing to address the body here tonight? For the record. And for the third and final time, anyone wishing to address the body tonight during the public hearing? Okay. I will close the public hearing at 4:40 p.m. and we'll move on to item number 6 on our agenda, is action on Plan 190057, Premier Wisconsin Rapids LLC. Commissioners, actually staff, Adam, do you want to walk through your report?
Certainly. Just want to try and clarify some things on what the request is before the commission. Obviously, it's in 2 phases, but this particular item is the rezoning request. The current zoning is R3, which is a multifamily zoning district, which has an allowable density of 1 dwelling unit per 3,000 square feet. So the total property is about 310,000 square feet. So conceivably, it would allow a density of up to 103 units. So that is under the existing zoning as it sits today. They could pursue site plan approval and get building permits on that as it sits today. The request before you is to change it from that R3 district to the R4 district. The density between the R3 and the R4, that is exactly the same. It's still 1 dwelling unit per 3,000 square feet. So the density isn't changed by the requested rezoning. What is changed by the rezoning is the type of housing that can be located there. Within the R3 district, the maximum dwelling unit size is 8 per building, meaning contained within 1 building, you can't have more than 8 units. The developer in this case is proposing a 12-unit building style. That is only allowed within an R4 district, which would allow technically up to 16-unit buildings. But again, the overall density is not changed by the rezoning, only the type of that housing style is impacted by this rezoning request. So I just wanted to clarify that. A couple of other things that I based my decision on, looking at our comprehensive plan, this area is shown as multifamily or mixed residential on our long-range plan. So the R4 district and the existing R3 district are both consistent with the long-range plan for the city. And then the final item that we generally look at is the surrounding neighborhood. As was noted in some of the comments, you have multifamily developments to the north, you have multifamily developments to the west, and you have multi-developments to the south in this particular location. Admittedly, to the east is single-family residential on a very large lot. However, that is currently within the town of Grand Rapids, so it's not zoned and cannot be impacted by the city at this time. So based on the trend of development, there has been additional apartments built over the last 10 years within this area. So it seemed to check, at least in my opinion, has the city planner checked all those boxes. So that is why city staff did recommend approval of the rezoning request.
Thank you, Adam. Joe, did you have anything further related to, I know there was some conversation at a staff level about the road and the access and that pertaining to the property to the north, but for this particular, did you have anything?
No, I mean, initially there were some questions, but I think those concerns about access have been identified and addressed by the developer.
Thank you. All right, commissioners. Comments, thoughts, questions for either the developer or for staff on the proposed rezoning? Alderperson Kubaschak.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. I guess I want to thank everybody that's in this room, and as Mr. Hittner mentioned, that this is a great civics lesson today. It's a case where this body is more of a quasi-judicial body, but when we have civic participation like this, in my opinion, it kind of makes a decision a lot easier for me. So I appreciate everybody's time and everything, and I will be voting no on this. Thank you.
Other commissioners, additional comments? There is no motion on the floor. I would entertain a motion as well.
I want to just make a comment that Scott, his comments that came forward about the need for development in this town is a very real thing. And I've been on this commission for, I think, coming up on 6 years now, and it is somewhat frustrating at times when we see these great opportunities come forward and then they get shut down because of not in my backyard. And in something like this, it is like a very clear, all we're doing is changing the number of units in a building, not the density or anything, and it could move forward, but yet there's so much objection to moving this community forward. And it is very important that we have development to keep this community moving forward and restore ourselves as a great community here.
Thank you. Commissioners, other comments? I have a question for the developer. Chris, you had stated that actually all the residents that signed a petition, there would be your tenants in the development to the south?
Yes, that's correct. So we operate that property. I think we began that about last summer. So.
Okay. And was there an open house or a discussion held at the resident level?
We did not. We did
Just
not
curious.
have that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And Chris, could you address maybe the safety issues that they have as far as walking in the general area as it relates to their current residents?
Yeah, I don't. You all have the site plan in front of you, correct? But I don't know that that they saw it. But there's no drive access through or adjacent to their property. So if they were remaining on the property that is Rivers Grove, it wouldn't impact any of their walking or anything that they do now. There's no reason for vehicles to drive through the grass onto their property. Furthermore, we have, as I mentioned, a management staff that does it, tend to our residents and make sure that everybody's complying to the requirements of our lease. And that is one of the unique things about being a landlord, is that we do have some relative control based off of those guidelines in the lease. So if we've got bad actors and we've got bad apples, we're able to evict them. And we take that very seriously because of concerns about this property next door or any homeowner like the nice lady that came up here before. So it's we're members of this community too, and we're taxpayers of this community, and it's important that we're good citizens and good neighbors. And if we're not, anybody can find us on the internet, our phone number, and certainly let us know. We have an office on site here at this development, so there'll be a caretaker that's available that our friends next door could certainly walk over and tell them if they are having a problem. So, we try to do our best in addressing those safety concerns and making sure our residents are abiding by good neighborly rules.
Thank you. Other questions, commissioners, or for Chris or otherwise? Joe?
I guess I got a question. I'm not sure who necessarily to direct it to, maybe Adam, as it relates to the 2016 housing study that was done and the need, and I think they broke into some numbers as far as how many new units should be built or within the next 5 years, and they came up with numbers. And of course, now we've the property on 16th and Pepper is all in place. We voted a couple of meetings ago for the senior center and some housing there. So if we were to add this property to that, where are we at in our study of where we're at for housing in Wisconsin Rapids?
Yeah, the housing study that was done in 2016, obviously, what it wanted to do was look at the existing housing and then the potential housing needs over the next 5 to 10 years. Within that study, and I apologize, I don't have the specific number of units because it's not trapped in my brain, but over the 5 to 10 year period, it was well north of 200 units were desired for multifamily, and then additional dwelling units for single family. In addition to that, it mentioned the need for quality housing. A large portion of our housing stock is pre-1970, which if it's well kept and well maintained, that's not an issue. But if it's not well kept and well maintained, those properties have the tendency to decline. So at least, again, in my opinion, this is hitting two of those things. Number one, it's adding the additional units we need. And number two, it's adding the quality housing that we need. This is a market niche that is not hit directly with new construction as of yet. The townhomes that were put up on 16th and Pepper, those were supported by tax credits, so those are workforce housing. So only up to a certain income level can reside in those units. The senior housing that was approved, that was age-restricted housing downtown, and again, that has some tax credits associated with it. This particular development is 100% market rate. The developer is paying 100% of the cost, and the rate is set by the market, basically, and what they need to maintain their money. So it is not in that same category of dwelling unit either. We have not had a market rate project since Fedorsky built in this somewhat similar area about 3 years ago.
Joe?
Chris, question for you. One of the comments was related on the stormwater pond. Can you describe the necessity of that particular feature? Describe a little bit about what it's going to look like, how it's going to behave, just so that people understand what that
Yeah,
really
I'm not an engineer. Both my parents are, but I can't pretend to give it to you. And again, unfortunately, my friend John's voice is low, so I'm going to do my best. Based off of the DNR standards, we have to maintain the runoff as it is now and not create any more. So that pond is to retain the runoff on our site. So John and his team at Dayville Engineering put our site into a program and make sure that the runoff, calculating the impervious and pervious areas, are maintained on our site and don't create any more issues. That pond is the tool that does that. In this case, it is a wet pond, so there will be some water that's left in there. I don't know if I'm missing any details on that, John, but that's the basic function of it, Joe, is to make sure that we don't create any more runoff than is already on the parcel. We have to do that per the DNR standards, and John files permits and applications along those lines, submitting his plans to the DNR.
Thank you.
Yep.
Other comments or questions, either for Chris or for the benefit of our discussion and decision here tonight? Okay, thanks, Chris. Commissioners, I'd entertain a motion if there is no further discussion. And I will remind the commission, we take affirmative motions, not necessarily from somebody that ultimately voting in the favor, so if the motion is to approve, not necessarily do you have to vote in the affirmative if that's a concern. Other comments, commissioners?
I motion to approve the rezoning from R3 to R4 for this parcel.
I have a motion by Burkhart to approve as presented. Is there a second? Second by Bry. Any further discussion, commissioners? And that would be, I got to make sure I've got this is for the rezoning, so that's the first staff report, right? Yeah, okay. Just want to make sure from the conditions or the summary standpoint that it's actually as presented. Okay. Any further discussion? We'll move into a vote. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Abstentions? I'll abstain. I'm actually going to call for a roll call vote just to make sure we've got the vote tally. Kubitschek? Burkhart?
Yes.
Hanson? Yes. Bry? Wesley? And I'm an abstention. So motion carried. 4 ayes, 1 nay, and 1 abstention, right? All right. So then for the members of the audience, as well as those that are interested in the process, this item will go on to the city council meeting at its meeting, I don't have the date in my mind, it would be the 19th of March here in this room at 6 p.m. So there will not be another public hearing, but the city council will formally have to adopt the recommendations of this group tonight. So there is no final decision here tonight. It's an advisory recommendation to the city council. Again, I'll echo the citizen engagement, so thank you for paying attention and obviously stepping up to be here tonight. I know that there's a lot of other things you could be doing with your time, and we appreciate your willingness to engage, so thank you. Move on to item number 7, Plan 190058, Premier Wisconsin Rapids LLC. The applicant is requesting site and architectural review for a proposed multifamily development. The subject property is located adjacent to 3411 Washington Street. And with that, I'll ask staff and then Chris if he wants to engage on this particular item.
So obviously, this is related to the same development phase. What just was heard by you was for the rezoning. So that gets the land use approval in place. In order to be able to pull a building permit, our ordinance requires site plan review. So that's when you're looking at the actual site layout and the specifics therein. So things like number of parking spaces, landscaping, the type of building, all of that is basically what is covered by this site plan review. So staff reviewed it against the ordinance. I tried to kind of go piece by piece through that. So hopefully you didn't, hopefully I covered the major issues. But ultimately, staff found that it was in compliance with our newly adopted zoning code. The one exception to that was landscaping. I'm still, quite honestly, I've been working with the engineer because the way our zoning code is written is it's intended to require landscaping around parking areas. Generally, that works very well, but in a development like this where you have a very long driveway and a lot of other access drives, that drives up the amount of paved area, which are not necessarily parking areas, in which it's debatable on whether or not they should be considered as areas that are required for landscaping, just because they're not really for parking. There's no way to minimize that. You need to get access. You need to get, for example, the fire department asked for additional access roads through the property. So that's been the one area that I've still been in contact with the developer on, trying to figure out what truly qualifies as parking and what that landscape requirement is. However, all the other aspects of landscaping were met, and in addition, they are committing to preserving as much tree cover there as possible, so the periphery of the site, they're not going to go in there and clear cut it like some other developers have done in the past. They're going to clear the area they need to construct it, but then try and maintain whatever mature tree growth they can around the exterior of that. So overall, planning staff recommended approval subject to 3 conditions. Basically, one is regarding that landscaping for the paved areas. Number 2 is that I haven't seen a lighting plan yet on this, but that's pretty standard. It's a numbers thing. They'll either comply or they won't, so that'll be reviewed by staff. And then just my catch-all condition of compliance with all other applicable codes and ordinances.
Thank you. Chris, did you have any additional comments in this at this stage?
I can just touch on those 2 real quickly, and obviously we're happy to comply with all the landscaping requirements and make sure that we have enough trees. We're fans of having as much protection in between our site and other sites, and make sure that we plant nice trees throughout. And then with the lighting, we usually use wall packs on the building, but we'll make sure that they comply with the photometrics required by the ordinances within your code. So I don't see those as either of them is controversial. We'll make sure we check those boxes for you.
Thank you. Commissioners, comments, questions? The floor is also open. Someone so wishes. I guess I would not really, playing out obviously the rezoning that'll ultimately have to take place at the city council, trying to bear in mind some of the resident concerns about access. And I guess I'm, to Scott Kellogg's comments earlier about wanting to make a good development better or something like that, I guess I'm trying to explore alternatives. If the developer's willing to put in a private drive and not require, and we're not requiring the need for a city street. I'm not sure how else we can make the site any safer, particularly protecting the health, safety, welfare of those in the adjacent areas. So I guess I don't have anything, I'm trying to offer something productive to the conversation, but I don't think there's anything that I can add in that regard. So commissioners, any comments, suggestions? Or a motion?
That was addressed in as a question. What will be the safety issue? How will that be resolved?
John's going to try.
The stormwater pond is designed in accordance with a DNR standard. That standard includes various safety measures. It limits the depth of the pond. It requires a safety shelf. It requires minimum side slopes so that they're safe. They typically do not require a fence around them, and there are several reasons for that. The fence can actually be counterproductive and hide somebody that's trapped inside. So it's better that they're visible and accessible, but they're made in a safe way.
Other comments, questions, commissioners, or a motion if someone so wishes?
It's looking more likely that President Trump will have to wield his veto pen for the first time. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell says critics of Mr. Trump's emergency declaration on the southern border have enough votes to pass a resolution blocking the move. Kentucky Republican Rand Paul is...
We have a motion to approve by Wesley. Is there a second? Second by Hanson. Any further discussion, commissioners or staff? Seeing none, we'll move into a vote. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? One in the negative. Motion carried. Thank you. Thank you, Chris. And we'll see you in a few, probably in a week or so, if you'll come to the council meeting as normally we expect. So thank you. Item 8, update and discussion on the update to the sign ordinance with Civitec. I see the folks from Civitec, or at least Charlie's here. Welcome back. It's been a little while, after a long while of engagement on the rezoning code, or the new zoning code, sorry.
Thanks for inviting me on a sunny day. So the packet that you have in front of you has a couple of documents in it. One is your current sign code. The other is dated February 22nd, 2019. That's kind of the one I'll walk through, if that's your wish. As starting to kind of gather information about your opinions about the sign code and where we should go from here, we wanted to just kind of give you a little bit of an update on what's happened with the Supreme Court ruling in Reed versus Town of Gilbert. And I don't know if any of you remember, but we talked about this briefly at one of the Plan Commission meetings when we were talking about the zoning ordinance. Content neutrality is very important. Your code does a pretty good job, but there's a few definitions in there and things like political sign, real estate sign. Basically, what the Supreme Court says is if you have to look at the sign to determine what type of sign it is, then it has content. So you can regulate by the size of the sign, you can regulate by the style of construction of the sign, where the sign's located, but you can't regulate based on what's written on the sign. And so that would be the goal, is to make sure that your sign code complies with that content-neutral standard. So again, we've listed those kind of 7 things that can be regulated, and it should be pretty simple and straightforward to draft the sign code update to match those. So then I'll have you turn to page 2 and really want to start to answer these questions so that we can kind of get an idea of where we're at, what your opinion of administering this current code is, and go from there. So if any of you have any thoughts on number 1, how would you describe the city's current sign regulation? Is it too strict? Is it too lax? Is it unclear? Remember when we talked about zoning, we started with kind of talking about flexibility. The less flexible a sign or a zoning ordinance is, the more clear it is. It doesn't mean it should be completely inflexible, right? Sometimes you have to be a little bit more flexible, which brings in some issues of clarity. So there's a balance that we'll have to strike as we move forward. So any thoughts on how your sign code is at this point?
Just one thing I would note for some of you who are a little newer to the commission, the last time our sign code was updated would have been 2013, I believe. So it's been about 5 years. So if in your mind, as you've been driving through town, and if you've noticed new signs going up in the last 5 years, that's under our current sign code. Anything prior to that was under a different code, which had obviously different regulations. So just as you're kind of thinking about new developments that have gone up, have you liked those signs, have you not? That's about the only way, without having my job of the joy of dealing with it every day. That's probably about the best way I would have for you guys to kind of have a sense of where you feel about the current code.
So Charlie, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. I guess one quick question that I got, as far as the existing signs that wouldn't be in compliance, are we going to establish non-compliance permits for them, or are we going to log somehow just in case if there was a fire or a sign got taken down or something?
So generally speaking, when you adopt a new sign code, if it's more restrictive, those existing signs, they're grandfathered. So there's nothing that says they have to be removed. I believe the laws have changed so that you cannot require them to be removed in a certain amount of time. It's just whenever they become functionally obsolete and are replaced. So the best we can do is basically do a visual survey of them, document it, take pictures up and down 8th Street, up and down Baker Street on what they exist prior, basically when that new code was adopted. So then that way we can monitor any new signs, determine whether or not they were put up under the old code or the new code, and then enforce it as it goes forward. Generally speaking, if it's a face change or a rebranding, at least under our current code, that wouldn't require it to be brought fully into compliance. That's just considered maintenance. It's when the structure would be removed or the entire sign is removed and a new one put in its place. That's when what would trigger it having to comply with the new code. Does that cover that?
So Charlie, you're looking for an answer to your intentions here tonight, just to make sure I'm clear for the sake of the commission's benefit as well. We want to walk through at least just kind of a preferences sort of feeling.
And we can go pretty quickly. I mean, if you don't have an opinion, fine, let's keep moving. It just gives us someplace to start.
Commissioners, any comments on the general impressions? Item 1, anybody have anything to say? I would just volunteer that I think our sign code was very liberal and very lax for a long, long time, and so it's hard for me to break my feeling from what we've been able to do with incremental improvements since the last update to something that maybe even be more restrictive. we had a great, healthy discussion. I think that most of the commissioners on the same page with a sign that was just off of the expressway, right? And I think the general consensus of the body was, we don't want these things to be too intrusive or too, ridiculous, basically, that it's hard to govern on, create a policy that applies to all these property districts, but I think we have to be sensitive to the neighborhoods, and I personally like monument signs. I like the classier look of signs, but I understand they do come at a cost, and some business owners don't like them because they're not as big and flashy and don't catch your attention. So I guess that would just be kind of how I would describe the situation as I see it, or as residents have volunteered opinions about unsightly signs, that these large billboard-style, very, very high or tall signs are probably a bit out of date, especially when you compare it to other communities and their sign codes. So unless anybody else has any other comments on that first question, we'll probably get into more specifics here. Charlie, want to go?
Yeah, and what our goal is to generate conversation. So if you have a thought that's maybe not related specifically to the question that we're asking, go ahead. Feel free to have this. This is an open, informal conversation. So what signs do you find unsightly?
Joe.
Yeah, I think along with what the mayor said, the large, real tall billboard type, and also some of the digital signs that are by themselves. If they're underneath another sign, they seem to look a little more attractive, but if they're just out there by themselves, they look pretty gaudy.
Other thoughts, commissioners, on that question? Unsightliness? Check.
I guess as far as discussion goes, I'm trying to think in my head where there's a terrible or a bad-looking sign in town, and I really can't think of anything. Now, do we want any to occur? No, but I guess I'm kind of pleasantly surprised as we're talking about this that there isn't anything that really sticks out in my head. But maybe I'm wrong. I don't know.
I think the only go ahead.
Tree Shopping Center is very unsightly on 8th Street.
And that's the former Reserve Blue Plaza, yeah. And is it unsightly in the sense of the size,
The height of
the
it.
upkeep, or the height?
And there, it's not conforming all throughout.
And I was going to address temporary. I guess you've got a couple of other varieties. Do you address temporary later?
Go ahead.
Okay, I was just going to say that I think it becomes a enforcement challenge for us to deal with a lot of the temporary sale signs. You see a lot of the quick trips now, it's the flavor of the day sort of thing. If they're, and I've seen them actually blow, you get high wind events and they're blowing on city property. And I don't know, Joe, if we've got any cleanup effort you can speak to, but it just seems like those hiring job fair type signs, I get that they're trying to convey a message and advertise it. It just seems like I question whether they're effective, and what should we be doing to regulate that type of sign, particularly when they're not removed after the event or they're just blown around town.
Yeah, they do pose a safety concern for traveling public and pedestrians if they're not secured and they can blow away. The other area that is challenging, and I think it's as much education as anything, are, and maybe not so much the realty signs, but realty signs and campaign signs that are placed out in the street right away. They don't belong out there. They can put them on private property, and I understand that the regulation of those on a temporary basis can be a challenge under the new regulations. But I do think that somehow we should try to educate the public, whether it's through the ordinance or through other methods, to keep those things out of the public right away.
Other thoughts, commissioners, on signs unsightly or just general comments? Okay. Adam?
Just a couple of things. Obviously, our current code, signs within the right-of-way of the temporary nature are not allowed. I know we fill up the trunk of the ordinance officer's vehicle routinely with those because they are an eyesore. So anything we can do to firm that up, make it clear, to make education easier on what temporary signs, if any, are allowed, Again, that was a big discussion when we updated the code several years ago, was do we want to allow temporary signs at all in that regard? Obviously, the new regulations make it harder a little bit, but I think that's a very necessary conversation, because if there is a type of sign that gets a business owner worked up, it's a temporary sign. It's that ability to, either they're having a sale or they're having a grand opening or whatever it may be, that's the one that we get the most questions or concerns on, just from an administrative standpoint. Again, our current code is pretty generous, so for the most part, if a new business is coming in either with a freestanding or a wall sign, for the most part, I don't get a lot of flack enforcing our current ordinance. It's really tied to what can I do for special events. So I would ask the commission, even if you don't have an opinion right now, think about that as we're going through this process, because ultimately, I think that's going to be the one that you're going to hear from probably potentially the most.
Thank you. Charlie, do you want to walk down?
Yeah, we see that a lot. I mean, that's a lot of communities that we work with, that's the same thing. Regulation of those temporary signs is actually quite easy because of the type of construction. If you think about businesses that do advertising, good businesses take a look at your ordinance and they advertise based on what's in your ordinance. Bad businesses don't look at your ordinances and they advertise whatever way they think they can. And so if you have a business out there that's recommending to a business owner that they put a bunch of little temporary signs in the road right away, they're violating the ordinance. That's not a good business. And the education of that business is pretty quick. And so, you know, yeah, they pop up and down and go in the trunk, but it's pretty easy to get it into the ordinance. And then the education campaign is, let's do good business in Wisconsin Rapids. Okay, sign companies, advertising companies, don't do these temporary signs, you know, because they're not legal. Find a different way to do an event. Find a different way to make a structural sign, whether that be on wheels or, you know, something that doesn't become a traffic hazard and that's not a litter hazard. So businesses typically adapt, and we see a lot of businesses adapting right now because most communities have the same or very similar opinions.
Thank you. Can move on to the next one if you like.
Okay, should digital signs be prohibited or specifically allowed with little restriction or with some control? So we're talking about signs that have movement. The thing that we find typical is 7.5 seconds. They're static for 7.5 seconds. That matches with our 60 seconds and 120 seconds. That's how that math works out. But you know, some go lower, some go 3 seconds, some go higher, some go 15 or 30. So those are things for you to consider as we're moving forward. And where should those be? Sometimes those are regulated away from residential neighborhoods because of that constant movement. Sometimes they're regulated away from distracting areas, things like that. So looking for your opinions on those digital signs.
Adam, have we had any feedback on, you know, because we've kind of worked through and developed a pretty good criteria for that. Has anything come back against or, you know, negative towards what we've kind of established?
Yeah, and it's either 6 or 7 seconds has been kind of what the commission has adopted on the last couple of animated sign regulations, is that it does have to be static for that amount of time. And then the lighting, usually that there has to be dimming device on it overnight so that it isn't at the same brightness and extra noticeable. The businesses that have adopted that, we haven't had issues with them. They haven't come back and said, this isn't working for me. We're having issues with it. So I think it's right in line with what Charlie is saying for other communities. And personally, I would continue to support that as the path forward. Whether or not it needs to come to this body like it does now, or whether we just incorporate those regulations in the sign code, I think would be another thing to consider.
Commissioners' comments on that question around electronic signs, or digital signs, sorry.
Well, I think because the commission has been consistent over the last few years, they've created a standard that is working. I think the bigger question is, right now, every single one needs to come through this body, through a public hearing and a zoning process. And my question is that necessary if at the same time the commission's putting the same conditions on every single one? Or do we just put those conditions in the ordinance for that type of sign and it's just done administratively?
I don't recall, do we limit which zoning, which zones can have them?
Yes, right now it's, I believe, limited to only the B2. So basically 8th Street, West Grand, Baker type of areas of the city.
Joe?
I think without getting too restrictive, the more we can make this an administrative process, the better. Because the commission does change over time, and you could have some very inconsistent decisions if the decision is always made up by the body. Whereas if there are some provisions in the ordinance that allow for some consistency, but perhaps there are things that need to be reviewed on occasion on, particular requests by the commission, I think that would generally be beneficial both to the applicant because it expedites the process and the community because it allows for some consistency.
Sensing that that's something, some direction that this body is looking to potentially walk down is some codifying of the existing standards of that particular issue. Any other comments related to the nuances within digital signs? I do support, I guess, the question around location, that there are certain business districts where they be allowed and certain areas where they just are not. Certainly closer to residential areas, but I think our West Grand Avenue business district, the 8th Street corridor, probably being the two areas that maybe even the expressway would be another limited exception.
Yeah, the only other area that I've gotten a little bit of pushback and we've found ways to allow it or not allow it is within institutional districts. High schools, grade schools, churches, they have a tendency to like the concept of at least an electronic reader board sign, something that they don't have to go out there and change manually all of the time. So that's another district.
And might we want to consider more neighborhood-friendly restrictions for those areas? Could you create a dual standard, one for, okay. So I think that would be something, being sensitive to that request, that's less intrusive maybe. Okay.
Okay.
Joe, did you have another comment?
Yeah, I was just going to mention with the more institutional type sign, perhaps some non-operational hours, similar to a noise ordinance, but
sure.
for lighting.
Sorry. So in the conversation we had earlier, talking about existing non-conforming signs or grandfathering, question 4 kind of gets to some of that a little bit when you talk about a trigger mechanism. So in question 4, if a person converts from a static sign to a digital sign, should they be required to reduce the overall amount of signage if they have more than what is otherwise allowable? So let's say they have quite a bit of signage. It exceeds the area of signage that's in the new code. It's existing non-conforming. They can continue like that as long as they want. But if they want to convert one of those signs to an electronic digital sign, should the ordinance require them to reduce the overall signage?
If they are required, can they apply for variance like anything else? Is that generally what would happen? They'd have to prove a hardship?
There should be very clear standards for when they can apply for variance and who they apply to in the ordinance.
Okay. I'm just thinking if there's a recourse to capture some of those unique situations where a hardship might be created, if in fact that was ultimately decided to do so. Commissioners, question or feelings about that question? I heard a yes. I mean, there are other opinions And likely, if they're going to convert to digital, it's probably a rework of the structure anyway. They're not going to stick a heavy digital sign on something that's not architect or engineered to withstand that. Other thoughts, one way or the other, commissioners? Okay, move on to the next one then.
Is the lighting for signs overly bright in Wisconsin Rapids?
Can't think of any instances. Adam, is there any instances from an enforcement standpoint that you've gotten, your office got complaints on?
About the one we get the most, and then we have to usually go and talk with the business owners, or when it's a flashing lighted sign. Even if it's as simple as the open signs you see that are red and blue and it flashes open, that generally, as far as lighted signs, is the majority of the complaints. But we don't have that bright sign that everyone comments on, that it's just too bright compared to anything else.
Something else for us to keep our eyes peeled for. I never thought about that being an item for regulation.
Should inflatable signs be prohibited?
Joe?
Does
A
that
good impression,
also
but-
include the, the temporary muffler guy,
The stick guy. Yeah.
Is that what you mean by an inflatable sign?
That's correct.
Okay.
We haven't had any real issues to date, have we, on?
Well, our current ordinance only allows them in the event of a special event. So if it's a grand opening for, I think it's 15 days, you can have the inflatable guy, you can have the banners, you can have that type of stuff. So if they pop up, they've been told that they need to come down. So I think that's partially why you don't notice them around this community very much.
Thoughts, commissioners, on inflatables? I guess I tend to favor allowing them if they haven't had, or
And we can have
some-
more discussion with
Yeah.
more detail at that time when we get to the specific drafting. We're just trying to gauge some thoughts. How about traveling signs and sign vehicles? So that would be a vehicle specifically designed with a billboard on it. You've seen probably a very small cab truck with kind of an A-frame behind it. That's a sign vehicle. Traveling signs, we can kind of talk about those specifics when we get there, but you get kind of a rough idea of what those might be.
Charter occasionally will run them through town. We've seen them on various occasions. I don't know if we see too many of them. Although you're also incorporating, like permanent vehicle signs, vans or what else, right?
Currently, we only regulate signage on a vehicle if it's being parked as a sign. So if you have an old pickup truck and you're an auto body repair shop and you have it sitting out front, Great Northern Distilling comes to mind, I guess. They have a decorative truck out front. That is their sign. That is regulated like any other freestanding sign under our current code. Just a business truck that happens to have a logo on it that's moving constantly and going around town, we do not regulate that currently.
Okay. Commissioners? Kubitschek?
Thank you. Thank you, Chairperson. Adam, can you, I guess because I don't know, can you elaborate on that further? For example, and maybe the charter vans don't park in front of the location on A Street that they own just south of the Shell gas station, which is just south of McDonald's there. But they do kind of park in the back, but now that's kind of their property. How is it, like, say, for example, because this is one thing that had been brought up to me in the past about like a semi-trailer with someone else's logo parked on a third-party property. Like, for example, if Rowdies or Cops had their own trailer in their back and they're unloading, I mean, you can understand that. But if it's obviously purely for advertisement, this semi-trailer hasn't moved, it's got a logo on there on the property not owned by that company, how is that addressed?
Currently, with difficulty. I don't think our current code really addresses it very well. It's kind of either it's a non-operating vehicle that's being used as a sign, or it's treated as just basically a business logo on a vehicle. So our current code doesn't do a good job, and I haven't done research on how other communities deal
So
with
if we were to split the two, we've got the vehicles that are used incidentally for business, maybe they're a charter van, but then you've got these insert vehicles that are used as traveling billboards. I think that's what you're getting at with
Yeah.
the other part, right? Just so I'm making sure I'm understanding what you're.
Yeah, we're not aiming at those charter vans. We're not aiming at a vehicle that's used by the business for, we're aiming at a vehicle that's designed specifically to be set in one place for advertising for a period of time. I guess we talked a little bit about it. What's your opinion of those? That the example that you gave is an off-premise sign. What's your opinion of that? Is that a good or a bad thing?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, that's a bad thing because at least I guess I wouldn't suggest that it's a punitive thing if it's like a Myron Construction or, Charter Sign or Solaris or whatever that's painted on a truck. And it isn't a major, obviously there is a desire to advertise the organization with it. But I mean, it's more incidental. But if it's an actual non-ownership of the business or whatever on a particular piece of private property, I think that, yeah, there is a desire to have that or even potentially even circumvent the signing requirement that we have. So I would be kind of in favor of regulating it or addressing something on that order.
Other thoughts, commissioners, on either components, traveling signs or sign vehicles? Okay. Move on to the next one then.
Should there be additional provisions specifically in the downtown district?
Do you see many communities having, where you've got, we just completed the zoning code rewrite, where you've got central business district, you've got designated overlay areas. Do you see I'm sure that you get the swath, you get those that really care a lot about the signs in certain parts of town, and then others where they're less. I guess give me a sense of what you're seeing the trends.
Well, I think since the Supreme Court ruling in 2015, we see a lot more of this because of the lack of ability to regulate based on content. Okay. So then there's, a much higher sense of finding different ways to make sure that the regulations are enough. And so, yes, we do see a lot more since 2015 regulated based on district.
Okay. Commissioners, thoughts on that front? Where you might like to see further review?
I think it does make sense to have additional scrutiny in our downtown overlay district. I mean, we look at that, we talked about it a lot to make sure, we are regulating other things in that district. I think signage is definitely a thing to have in there.
I think if you think about infill development versus a greenfield development, whereas one on an A street or another corridor, we're more likely to have more cookie cutter brand standards by a CVS or a Applebee's or something, whereas think about like a downtown, it's unique architecture, it's likely to be a unique construction or remodel, so perhaps that seems to fit.
And how would this relate to a farmer's market, which is probably downtown?
Right.
Probably got a truck with a sign on the side.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, and right. Yeah, right. Where does it fit in the definitions is probably the big question. Anybody have any comments either for or against additional review? Though sometimes I think the market at the mall, they had a permanent, like a semi-permanent sign that they put up to advertise the market and things. So those are special events. Do we count for them now under special events?
The market one, that was done by a conditional use, basically. I'm trying to remember what triggered that, but that was allowed as a permanent sign, so that one didn't have to move. If it is I don't think we allowed them anywhere else besides that downtown one.
Okay. Not on the Aspirus market? I don't know. There's like a temporary one they set up maybe on market days or something. Joe?
Just a hypothetical, if you had a business selling, say, fireworks on 8th Street, and they brought in a full-size semi-trailer, they were selling out of a tent, they just had a small delivery truck delivering every day, right? That semi-trailer is a sign, it's not part of their daily activity. Is that something that we would regulate now and consider that a sign? Or could they successfully make the argument that, well, that's just here while we're here, it's part of our operation? Or doesn't that matter?
I have not had to enforce something like that yet.
Okay.
Not saying it won't become an issue, because if we were to become more restrictive overall, you're going to find some companies, much to Charlie's point, probably not the good companies, but other companies are going to try and find ways around it. So it's like any regulation. You can try and close as many loopholes as you think of, but they'll probably find something that we'll have to address.
And are you suggesting, Joe, that if the semi is used for the purpose of their business, that would be appropriate, but for one that's using it for purely a sign purpose? So if you're a potato wholesaler or something, you're bringing your potatoes, you're storing them in the semi, that would, and they had a billboard on the side.
Yeah.
You're suggesting that would be inappropriate.
That would be appropriate if they're working out of it, or that's what's being used to deliver produce for the day. But if it's parked there and they're using it as a sign.
Yeah.
If they're, if that's an issue, other
Yeah.
places are.
In your hypothetical situation, Joe, I'm storing fireworks in it. There's going to be crappy situations. But if you make, and it looks like you want to make a concerted effort for special events, and you can show people you're making a concerted effort, you can get a permit, we allow these things to happen, but we don't allow these things to happen. You're doing a really good job of writing a code, and in the court of public opinion, you've done a good job of writing a code, and you've given them options. They just didn't like the options, and they went for something else. At that point, I think you have a pretty good case of enforcement. So that's what you got to do, is you've got to give them some good options to make sure they can advertise their business, to make sure they can do what they want to do. And they're just taking it that step further. And yeah, it sucks to enforce in that situation. But at a point, it's just like anything else.
And would that design review happen at a commission level? I mean, if we're talking about the design downtown district? Okay.
I would say we're going to take a look at the zoning ordinance and see how some of those other things are written and try to be very consistent with that. But that's going to be also up to you as we write this to think about it. But that's what we would recommend.
I think just balancing the comment earlier about administratively handling things versus having to commission and for the sake of the applicant and all that. So, okay.
Yeah, if you can handle it within the confines of another meeting for another review and minimize that for everybody, that's a really good thing. So question 9 is kind of a follow-up to number 8. Oh, no, I guess it's not. It's for the universal sign stuff. Do people apply for permits when they're required to do so? Question for Adam.
Yeah, if it's a sign company, yes. I mean, they know the code, they get it. A lot of times, if it's a small business that either is a new business and never done it before, those are the type that we generally have to go and knock on the door and say, we need to get this permitted properly. I would say, if I would throw a percentage, I'd say probably 3 out of 4 get permits.
And enforcement is usually pretty simple. Here's the code.
Yeah, once if they did it without a permit, once they understand that it was necessary, it's not an issue. Again, our current one is fairly generous, so the sign that popped up without a permit would have been permitted. It's just getting the paperwork.
And that's typical. I mean, for enforcing a sign ordinance, if, let's say it's 7.5 seconds of static and somebody's got it at 4, you contact them via phone call or email, they're typically like, yep, that makes sense. I'll change it right now, and they can program it, So most of the time, we're not talking difficult enforcement. The times you talk difficult enforcement really is just somebody, I don't know, they just don't want to follow. Okay, 10, is the process for getting a permit easy to understand currently?
It's a 2-page permit application. First page is basically contact information and sign information. I feel it's relatively straightforward.
Number 11, are the permit fees too high?
Current fee is $50 per sign.
We don't do any sliding scale or,
No, we used to have it based on the size, which never made a lot of sense to me. So if it's a freestanding sign, if it's one freestanding sign, it's $50. If it's multiple wall signs, it's $50 per wall sign.
And, I'm sorry, go ahead. Are those permanent signs then, Adam?
Correct, those are permanent.
Do we have a fee for temporary or like a 15-day sign?
Yeah, our special event signs, which are 15 days per special event, up to 4 times per year, is a $10 basically special event sign. And so those are the 2 categories that we allow.
and people have been taking permits for those, or is it always we're forcing it and then they're taking a permit?
We don't issue a lot of temporary ones anymore. So most of them, once they're told that they're not allowed without a permit, they just take them down. So most people,
Even though $10 or
yeah,
insignificant.
because it's 15 days at a time, and what they want to do is they want to have it up for 2 months, 3 months. So it's not a fit for what they're trying to do with a temporary sign.
Joe?
Adam, with the temporary signs and the associated fees, do you find that the administrative time to review the temporary is a fifth of the time of reviewing a permanent sign?
Yes and no. Yes, because for a temporary sign, again, the way the current ordinance is basically, we don't necessarily look at the number of signs, the square footage, is it over or is it not, because it's for a specific event. So it's really just collect the dates with a description of what it is, and it's issued, versus a permanent sign, we're having to do the calculations, figure out what signs are there. So there is more time with permanent.
I think good conversation, though, was when you brought up there's some demand for 2 months, 3 months. Is that something that you think the ordinance should include? Is something for a interim or?
I'm torn. I mean, personally, I don't know if others have opinions about that. Part of me is if people are willing to pay for a permit that's not $10, maybe for a longer period of time, they're getting value out of it, right? And I think if it can be regulated as such that it's, we're happy with it, I tend to favor the ability for people to have those signs. I know the temporary nature for the 3 months is more apt to go to the contrary to my earlier point, not seeing these things littered around town or blown around. But so I'm not sure if there's a happy medium that to be struck there. But if they're willing to be regulated and be willing to pay an actual fee that maybe is more commensurate to the value they're receiving, I don't know. I guess I don't have a proposal on that. Do you see places where they found something that works well in that interim period between permanency and a 15-day window or something?
I don't have any good examples in my head. It's an administrative nightmare, in my opinion, because everybody says 2 to 3 months and nobody means it.
Yeah, right.
So that's one where that's a more difficult to wrap your arms around.
Thanks. Other thoughts, commissioners, on that?
I just have, like a thrift sale or garage sale sign or a political sign, are they supposed to go and pay $10 and get a, no?
Not under our current code, but that's because we're regulating content, probably not legally. So we say an election sign is allowed a different time frame than a rummage sale sign, even though technically they're the same temporary sign. Both of those currently do not require permits.
So, but going forward, having taken content out of it, is there a suggestion on how to deal with that? I mean, I don't think people are going to go pay $10 to put up a thrift sale sign, or even know that they have to do it.
At least what I have seen is the regulated permitted signs are generally in the commercial districts. So again, it's tied to a business. If it's something that is a homeowner related thing, such as an election sign or a political message sign or a garage sale sign, those have traditionally been allowed without a permit. They just have regulations on how long they can be up. So if we get a complaint on a rummage sale sign that's been up for 3 months straight, we can document that and make them take it down because of how long it's been up, even though it's not a permitted sign. Does that make sense?
And this is where you may run into trouble. Because if you're in the business district and you can't put out a temporary little flyer sign, why should you be able to in a residential district? You know, that's where there's going to need to be some political will to support the differentiation. Why are they different? They're both the same exact sign. In fact, more than likely, your rummage sale sign is even more poorly constructed than. So, I mean, that's the difficulty that you're going to need to think about as the Plan Commission is treating everybody fairly, treating people fairly equally, and also if you consider this a traffic hazard, then this is definitely a traffic hazard. You know, so those are things we'll talk about as we move forward.
Other comments on that one before we move on to the next? Okay.
Is sign maintenance a concern? Now we're talking about permitted signs.
For us, and it's probably admittedly more of an enforcement issue, it's the signs on businesses that have closed down. So that's more of the enforcement issue or a concern versus if it's an operating business, we generally don't get complaints on them. That's partially because we don't allow a lot of temporary signs under our ordinance that are there for a long time. But we have generic language, and most times if it's a banner that's faded and torn, we tell them and it comes down relatively easily.
So the Chamois Car Wash or the repair shop X, Y, and Z, if they're closed, what regulation or authority do we have to have them remove or clean up or maintain perhaps their signs?
Yeah, current ordinance, and I'm assuming the new ordinance would have language that says if it's not an operating business, that sign has a certain time frame, it has to be removed. Biggest concern is generally you're dealing with a business that does not exist for whatever reason, so finding someone, or it's a landlord, like the Chamois one was an issue because it was being held by a bank, and then now it's owned by the county, and so they're not ones that are going to want to invest in it. So getting enforcement short of trying to write citations to the county to take down a sign, that's where we run into more problems versus if it's a good landlord, they're going to want that down because they're marketing the space anyway.
Okay. Other comments? Kubitschek?
I guess for clarification on that, Adam, and maybe we can discuss it a little or find what we can do. That's the one thing that has popped into my head as far as signs go, is closed businesses, and not with a kind of a temporary or a rudimentary sign, but actually a fixed sign, maybe with steel columns or concrete base or whatever else, that is not necessarily in disrepair, but it does get faded or it's unsightly or it's not painted right or it's whitewashed and now the white paint is coming off or something. And there are, I'm not going to point any specific addresses out here, but there are several of them that I can think of off the top of my head. As far as the time limit goes now, is there a concern with requiring a property owner to dismantle a permanent sign if they have intention of trying to sell the property, or is there a valuation of having that sign? Because if they were to tear it down, now the new sign would have to comply with the new sign ordinance. Is this something where we would be unduly restricting property owners from having this particular apparatus, especially if it's not really the greatest looking thing, but if it isn't absolutely unsightly, you know, if it isn't in disrepair, but it just it looks like a sign that doesn't have a name on it, you know, it's like, well, it kind of looks like it may be something from I guess a down district, and we kind of don't want that. But how would we remediate that type of situation?
I think your landowner is going to have a choice. If the sign is in disrepair and if the business is abandoned, you can require them to remove it. But if they make it look decent, So what's their investment? Is there investment in removal, or is there investment in making it look good, making it look decent? And as an enforcement specialist, I'm sure those are not the ones Adam wants to worry too much about. And when I do enforcement, it's a matter of making a phone call and saying, what's your choice? Do you want it to look decent enough to stay, or do you want to tear it down? And that's a choice on the landowner's part based on your code. And so your current code has those provisions in it, and your new code will. And it's really just making sure that landowner knows that they have a choice.
Thank you. Other comments, commissioners, on that one? Okay. 13, Charlie?
Yeah, lucky 13. Do you want to regulate murals? Anybody have any questions on what a mural is?
I'm assuming they're fixed to the building, or is there a definition that separates permanent, fixed, or non-permanent?
Yeah, images permanently on a building, that sounds right.
Okay. I don't have any strong opinions. We do get into tough territory when we're starting to regulate content, right, per the Supreme Court decision. How are others dealing with that? If a business owner or a property owner wants to put a large mural on their building that is anything, they can basically do that, unless our local code prescribes something differently. But what can we do? What's the narrow space we can still occupy regulations in?
So if it's a wall sign, there's a specific square footage for it. If it's a mural, do you want that to be regulated by the same square footage, or do you want it to be allowed more flexibility to be larger? And what we typically see is murals are most of the time a community-type project. There are times when it's just a business owner that wants to do a mural, but most of the time they're a community-type project. And so we do have some communities that are more community-minded or community-forward, and they allow more flexibility for murals. Typically, they're just regulated the same as a wall sign, and so they only get the same square footage as a wall sign.
Can we do them via conditional use? So you've got a public hearing. I know that we probably don't want to open ourselves up to more public hearings sometimes, but I think that would foster maybe a healthier content discussion, keeping ourselves within the rails, though, of what we can regulate and not. I guess, commissioners, do you have any opinions about how we perhaps could be regulating murals, or Adam?
I'm not normally one for more conditional uses in this world, but one advantage you have is that you can, if a mural is going through that, most times the problems with murals are they look great and everyone loves them when they're first put up or painted, and then 5-10 years goes down the line and who's responsible for what. If it's a conditional use, you can assign that through the conditional use, that it's only allowed if someone is maintaining it, and who's responsible. It's the property owner or it's this nonprofit, and you specifically spell that out in a conditional use. So that is one advantage to that. Our current code just treats it as a wall sign. So we do not have a special process for murals currently.
Thoughts, commissioners, on murals? Kind of indifferent. All right, Joe.
Yeah, I think the challenge is, with the current laws and not being able to regulate content, but there's still locations where a mural might be, regardless of content, might be appropriate, and other locations where it simply might not. And I think potentially having a conditional use process for that review does make some sense.
Would we open ourselves up with the way that conditional use is now, where we can't really be arbitrary, we got to be more, if it makes sense, we almost, as a plan commission and or city council, have to approve a conditional use if it complies?
Standards. Any thoughts, Charlie or Adam?
Yeah, and exactly what the both have said is, if you've got kind of normal standards for that conditional use permit, so, maintenance is important, location, maybe there's some things that you look at scientifically that say, this is a good place for it or not. It may be based on traffic, or I can't come up with all of them right away, but, from that standpoint, that's a great catch. I mean, that's a really good way of thinking about this process. So make sure that if you do have a conditional use permit, you've got the conditions and standards kind of already started to be set. That's excellent.
Then I guess I wouldn't be opposed to having it be involved with a conditional use process.
So anything else in general that you want to start us off with, and we can use this information to get you some drafting to get started.
We've got a couple minutes. I've just advised that this room is occupied at 6, but I think we'll be done by then anyway. Anything else? General comments? Maybe give us a quick path forward in terms of what level of engagement we've got planned here on this topic.
I haven't exactly been involved in some of the conversations between Tim and Adam, but I really think this can move pretty quickly because you've got a pretty good ordinance already.
Great. Okay. Adam?
We haven't really outlined a process forward. I think one other thing the commission should think about is whether or not you want to do an open house or some sort of kind of midway point interview with the public on this project, or if this is something that you're confident and comfortable enough just going through our normal process. Just something to think about.
I'm not opposed to a public, so that we can say, hey, this is the time, everybody has, input in it, and, just like we did with our zoning rewrite.
Yeah, we found them to be effective, and people have attended those things. I think it's a good thing,
Yeah.
especially for us to be informed about what we're not thinking about. As blinds, we don't do this every day. We're not one of the good or the bad sign companies, any of us, so. Anything else? All right, I'd entertain a motion to adjourn, commissioners. Motion by Kubaschak. Is there a second? Second by Wesley. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Thank you all for being here and your attention tonight.